Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the Pacific Salmon Foundation's new State of Salmon Report. I'm Jason Hwang, the Chief Program Officer and Vice President at the Pacific Salmon Foundation. Today, I'm joining this event from Vancouver, the traditional territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations, and I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional territories from which you are joining us from. We will be welcoming questions today using the online interactive platform Slido. Now would be a good time for you to log into Slido so that you are all set to ask questions when the presentations are done. If you go to slido.com and use the meeting password SALMON, you should be able to log in. We've posted a poll in Slido that you can fill in right now so that we can all see where people are joining from today. If you respond to the poll in Slido, Slido will produce a word cloud so that we can all get a picture of where people are joining from. So we'll have a look at that as it builds, and we'll come back to it a little bit later before we start the formal presentation so that we can get a nice picture of where people are from. I already see a few locations showing up in the word cloud. We're really pleased to have you join us today for this special presentation on the recently released 2025 State of Salmon Report. We're here to help shed light on the daunting question, how are Pacific salmon doing? As you will know from working with salmon, it's always complex, and there's never just one story when it comes to salmon in BC and the Yukon. People who work with salmon know there are more than 400 different conservation units, and every one of those has a different story. Sometimes we need to go to that level of detail to answer the question of how salmon are doing, but sometimes we need a higher level roll-up to paint a more overarching picture. Something that helps describe the overall picture, but not so complex that we can't provide a response in a minute or two. Something that is reliable and based on actual data, but not so complex that only analysts and experts know what it means. In response to this need, the Pacific Salmon Foundation launched its second State of Salmon Report, building on the first report from 2024. The results give us a clear, high-level picture of how salmon are doing in BC and the Yukon, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. Our goal for the State of Salmon Report is to provide a clear, accessible summary to inform the public and decision makers on where salmon are declining, where they're improving, and hopefully guiding future actions for conservation and rebuilding and management efforts. It's also important to acknowledge that salmon headlines range from year to year. We all know that. But for example, this year we celebrated many good salmon stories, such as the high pink salmon returns in many systems. But in order to better understand how salmon are doing, we need to know more than just what happened in any one year. We also need to know how salmon returns have changed across the years. The State of Salmon Report provides a longer-term context for those stories, grounding short-term fluctuations in the broader picture of abundance and trends over time. The purpose of our coming together today is to introduce you to the report and its key findings, demonstrate the functionality and features of the interactive website, and to answer your questions. This report would not be possible without our partners. Thank you to the Province of British Columbia and Sitka Foundation for supporting this important work. And a big thank you to our internal State of Salmon team at PSF for their dedication and expertise over the years in developing this robust report. So again, a reminder for all of you joining us today to please go to slido.com and get ready to enter your questions. The code is SALMON, and to support the discussion that we'll have following the presentations. So let's just check back in to see where you're all tuning in from in our Slido poll. Looks like there's a big presence here from Nanaimo, Vancouver, Victoria, and Kamloops. I see Nanaimo, Traditional Territory, Sydney, Merritt and Nlaka'pamut Territory. Pleased to see people joining from the Yukon in Whitehorse. I see a couple from the unceded territory of Comox First Nation. It's wonderful to see the range. There's a presence here from Dawson City. I hope people can see this, and it gives you a sense of sort of who you're in the virtual room with, and it can help inform the context for our discussions today. So thank you all for filling in the poll. It looks like everybody's figuring out how to use Slido. On that note, it's my pleasure to introduce two members of our PSF team who will share key findings and insights from the State of Salmon Report. So I'll welcome Katrina Connors, our Senior Director of Salmon Programs, and Stephanie Peacock, our Senior Analyst with our Salmon Watersheds Program. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Katrina and Stephanie.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks very much for joining us today. as Jason said, Stephanie and I will be walking you through this year's State of Salmon Report. And we're going to start off by providing a brief overview of how we assess the state of salmon. We'll then touch on the key findings from this year's report. Then we'll briefly talk about how PSF is using this work to guide the work we do on the ground. And then we'll wrap up with a very brief demo of the State of Salmon website so that you know where and how to find all of this information for yourself. But before I jump into the key findings, I wanted to build off Jason's opening remarks and expand a bit more on why PSF has created this State of Salmon report. And the short answer is that we want to help the general public, many of you on the call today, understand what is the state of salmon. And it's a question that we here at PSF get asked a lot. And as simple as a question as this might be, it's actually surprisingly difficult to find the answers to online. And it doesn't mean that there isn't any information available online. In fact, as Jason said in his opening, we're often flooded with stories about salmon in the news. And sometimes these are really positive stories talking about impressive returns. Other times it's stories about salmon declines. But when you put these often conflicting stories together, it's really difficult for the average person to get a sense of how salmon are doing. And a good example of this is this year with the state of Fraser sockeye return. And we certainly heard lots in the media about the exceptional returns to the Fraser, not just for pinks, but certainly for Fraser sockeye. And so this figure that we're looking at here shows us the cumulative count of sockeye entering the Fraser River since July. And you can see that fairly on in the season, about mid-August, sockeye surpassed the preseason forecast of just under 3 million sockeye, continuing on to abundances that have been called record highs by some. And this really begs the question, are these really record highs for sockeye that we're seeing this year? And ultimately, to answer this question and to understand the state of sockeye, we need to look back in time. And when we do that, we can actually see that the return this year, about 8 million sockeye in 2025, was regularly seen for this brood line through the 1980s and 90s. And so that really is the role of the State of Salmon report. It's to help put the current salmon returns in context by taking a data-driven approach to looking at the state of salmon. And this historical information helps us understand if salmon returns that we're seeing in a given year are better or worse or the same as years past. And without this historical context, it's really difficult to understand present-day returns and know whether or not we should be feeling optimistic or pessimistic about what we're seeing. So diving a bit more into how we assess the state of salmon, our report looks at 6 species of Pacific salmon in Canada. And this includes Chinook, coho, pink, sockeye, and steelhead. And spatially, we divided our assessments into 10 major salmon-bearing regions in BC and the Yukon. And for those of you that were tracking our report from last year, one notable change for this year is that we split one of the regions, the Vancouver Island and Mainland Inlet regions, into 2 separate regions, East Vancouver Island and Mainland Inlets and West Vancouver Island. And this split is really intended to better capture the unique ecology and environment of these 2 regions that affects the state of salmon there. So in terms of our assessment approach, in order to assess the state of salmon, we relied on 2 types of information on salmon abundance. So the first type of information is spawner abundance, which is the number of fish that make it back to their spawning grounds to survive and to reproduce. And from a conservation perspective, how many fish are surviving to contribute to the next generation is ultimately what we care about. But given the potentially high levels of harvest for some species in some regions, spawner abundance alone doesn't necessarily reflect how many fish are actually returning each year because it excludes fish that might be harvested in fisheries. So given this, we also consider what we call total abundance, which is the number of spawners plus the number of salmon that are harvested in fisheries. And it's important to note that total abundance also accounts for salmon that maybe make it back to their spawning grounds, but potentially don't survive to a myriad of reasons. And we often call this pre-spawn mortality. So taking these data, we look at 2 different metrics to characterize the state of salmon. This includes both the current state, which really is intended to capture what's happening with salmon right now, as well as trends in abundance through time. So the main metric that we focus on throughout the report is current state, which is the abundance of salmon over the most recent generation, which is shown in this example by the red fish, compared to the long-term average abundance, which is shown as a dotted line here. This year, we actually introduced a new critically low state that's applied to all regional salmon populations that have fewer than 1,500 spawners. And this is actually a threshold below which the population is considered to be at risk of local extinction. And it aligns with approaches taken in other conservation assessments, such as those conducted by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but also the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And in 2025, when you applied this new critically low state, we saw that both Columbia Chinook and Columbia Steelhead were assessed as critically low with fewer than 1,500 spawners. We also report on trends in abundance, as I mentioned before, which can offer complementary information on the state of salmon. And this includes looking at long-term trends in abundance that's based on all years of data, as well as short-term trends over the most recent 3 generations. In terms of the data sources for this year, we also made some notable improvements in terms of the scope and the currency of the data included in the report. For those of you that read our report last year, we assessed spawner abundance for 41 regional salmon populations and total abundance for 14. And we primarily relied on data from 2022 and to a lesser extent 2023. This year, we've increased that number to 49 and 21 regional salmon populations, providing even more information on the state of salmon. And we've also been able to improve the currency of the data, with most assessments for this year's report drawing on data from 2024. And together, these advancements demonstrate our commitment to ensuring the information we present is up to date as possible, and that we're really drawing on the best publicly available information to characterize the state of salmon. So this brings me to the key findings from this year's report. And for the purposes of the presentation today, I'm just going to be focusing on 4 high-level key findings. There is, of course, a lot more information in the report, and I encourage you to dive deeper and explore the information on your own time, since I'm only going to be able to hit the high notes today. So the first key finding is that 2/3 of all regional salmon populations are below their long-term average abundance. And this is actually similar to our key finding from last year, so it shouldn't come as a big surprise. And when you look across all 6 species and all 10 regions, you really get that picture that the vast majority of salmon are below their long-term average abundance, as you can see in the red here. But there are some green patches as you look at the results, particularly among Chinook and sockeye populations in the south. This actually leads us to our second key message, which is that increasing numbers of sockeye and Chinook are sparking hope in some regions. And this is really some important news, good news. After years of closure, sockeye fisheries are reopening in places like the Skeena and the Nass, and spawner abundance is well above average in these regions. In other places like the Columbia, we see that sockeye returns are exceeding expectations. And this is important since sockeye were nearly wiped out in the Canadian portion of the Columbia for more than 80 years, largely due to the construction of multiple dams that prevented their migration to their spawning grounds. And then we're also seeing Chinook returns to the south coast, including East Vancouver Island, West Vancouver Island, as well as the Fraser, showing signs of promise. Our third key finding focuses on pink salmon and the fact that they're thriving across many regions in BC and the Yukon. And this pattern is actually not unique to Canada. It's something that we're actually seeing more broadly across the North Pacific. And in fact, pink salmon is something you might know are the most numerically abundant species of salmon in North Pacific. And in 2023, we actually saw the highest abundance on record for pink salmon since the 1920s, with more than 1 billion pink salmon returning to watersheds across the North Pacific. And we're certainly seeing these high abundances across various regions in BC. And in fact, in some regions, pink salmon returns were quite literally off the charts. We actually had to revise the way that we present this information in this year's report, creating a new category that's more than 150% above the long-term average. But as good as this news is, it's important to note that this isn't the pattern that we're seeing everywhere. And in some regions for pinks, like the northern transboundary watersheds and Haida Gwaii, pink salmon are still below their long-term average. Our final key finding is that northern regions are continuing to experience widespread decline. And this includes places like the Yukon, northern transboundary watersheds, Haida Gwaii, and the Central Coast. And it's also worth noting that our assessments for these northern regions are increasingly reliant on sparse data. And these data gaps make it really challenging to get a handle on the true scope and the magnitude of the declines that we're seeing. Now, this key finding, when you look at the results, you can really see what jumps out is that there are a number of redfish in the north and that many species are struggling. But what you can't see in this figure is the number of spawner surveys, so the information that went into generating these numbers. And what we've been seeing is that the number of surveys being conducted is dropping significantly. In fact, several PSF published a paper quite recently that found that the most recent decade was the worst decade for data since modern day record keeping began in the 1950s. And this is important to note because the decline in monitoring directly affects our ability to report on the state of salmon. And an example of this is on the Central Coast. And when you look at this year's report, it looks like Chinook spawner abundance has increased to 10% above the long-term average, up from minus 51% below average in last year's report. And when looking at this information, it's important to note that last year we based our assessments based on data obtained from 82 different spawner surveys. Unfortunately, this year, only a small fraction of those 82 spawner streams were monitored, which meant that we weren't able to construct a reliable estimate of spawner abundance for 2025. And instead, we had to rely on just 2 indicator systems reported by the Pacific Salmon Commission. So given the increasingly sparse monitoring and data we have to go from, we do have some pretty big concerns about the state of Chinook throughout this vast region. And more broadly speaking, our concern is that if monitoring continues to decline, it will be difficult to know how salmon are doing across all regions in BC and the Yukon, and ultimately what we can do to help them. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Stephanie, who's going to walk through the remainder of the presentation and conclude with a brief demo of the State of Salmon website.
Thanks, Katrina. So the results that Katrina shared are the main component of our 2025 State of Salmon report. But they do beg the question, what are the factors affecting the state of salmon? And so first off, I just want to mention that it's important to recognize that salmon have complex life cycles that span both freshwater and marine habitats. And there's never a single pressure that is causing the patterns in abundance that we see. In the State of Salmon report, we do highlight some of the main factors contributing to patterns in abundance. And these include climate change, which is one of the biggest threats across regions and species and affects salmon throughout their life cycle. Climate change is also affecting the frequency and severity of natural disturbances like forest fires and landslides, such as the one we saw this past year in the Chilcotin. Other natural pressures include competition and predation, although humans are also affecting these ecological interactions, for example, through the addition of hatchery salmon into food webs. And although hatcheries can be a useful conservation and education tool, hatchery fish compete with wild salmon and can interbreed to influence the natural genetic diversity and have potential negative impacts on wild salmon populations. Other human activities like urban development, industrial development, and fisheries and aquaculture directly impact salmon health and survival. And our initial look at these factors was cursory, but we plan to expand this section of the report next year to explore how each of these factors affect salmon and identify which factors are likely having the greatest impact in each region. And so given the state of salmon and the factors affecting them, what is the path forward? There's clearly a lot of work ahead. As Katrina said, 2/3 of these regional salmon populations are below their long-term average. But one thing is clear, there's no single group or organization or institution that can do it alone. And that's why PSF collaborates closely with partners on a range of initiatives designed to address the factors impacting salmon. I'm going to just walk through a few of these, but I do want to highlight this is just a snapshot of work happening within our organization and more broadly. So first of all, we have the Salmon Health Program, which evolved out of the Strategic Salmon Health Initiative. And this program works collaboratively collaboratively with scientists from GFO and universities to lead cutting-edge research that can guide salmon health management and the development of evidence-based policy for salmon aquaculture. And as an example, this program worked closely with local First Nation partners on monitoring the impacts of farm removal in the Broughton Archipelago. On the climate change front, PSF has a number of initiatives focused on impacts to salmon, including a climate emergency fund that was launched in 2023 to help salmon survive climate emergencies and natural disasters. So far, this fund has supported over 30 projects and over $750,000. And this work has included projects such as the one pictured here, which was work to monitor and improve fish passage through the Bridge River Rapids near Lillooet at low flows. And so these low flows are occurring more frequently with climate change and causing potential migration delays or even barriers at that location. And so this fund has been able to support work to understand the impact on salmon and try and get at potential mitigation measures. PSF has also worked broadly to assess threats to salmon freshwater habitats, leading habitat status assessments for all salmon-bearing regions in BC and the Yukon. These assessments highlight areas of high and low threat of degradation based on spatial data of pressures that include urban and industrial development and other activities like forestry, mining, as well as natural disturbances like forest fires. And this information can help guide resilience planning. And I use that term to include both broad-scale strategic planning to protect high-quality habitats and also work to restore threatened habitats. We recognize that the diversity of salmon habitats underpins the diversity of salmon. And when it comes to the path forward, maybe one of the most important points is that this diversity of salmon is what will confer resilience to these species in the face of all of these pressures. Salmon are an incredibly diverse group of species, and the State of Salmon Report has focused on really coarse, aggregated regional salmon populations for each species. But within each of these regions, you can dig into any one of these regional salmon populations, and you'll find multiple unique groups of fish that have distinct genetics, life history traits, and habitats that may respond differently to common threats. And this is just a snapshot that illustrates you can have different populations that have different status outcomes, even with an aggregate abundance that's above average. And so these different groups, which are called conservation units, are important components of the regional population because they ensure that the species as a whole and the ecosystem and social and cultural benefits that these species provide are buffered against change. This is often called the portfolio effect in reference to the stability of diverse financial portfolios. And this diversity also provides the ingredients for salmon to adapt to climate change. It's literally about not having all your eggs in one basket, but trying to conserve these different unique groups of fish within the regional salmon population. And so I do want to mention that in addition to the broad overviews available in PSF's State of Salmon Report, we also share population and habitat assessments at the scale of conservation units through a companion site called the Pacific Salmon Explorer. And these different scales of reporting on the status and trends of salmon reflect the different scales of salmon diversity, and they're all important. So I encourage you to check out the Salmon Explorer and dive deeper into the status of these unique conservation units within each region. The importance of salmon diversity and resilience to the path forward is reflected in PSF's vision of healthy, sustainable, and naturally diverse salmon populations, and in our recent strategic plan, which emphasizes salmon resilience as one of the 3 key areas of impact that we're trying to influence. But we do recognize that without an understanding of how salmon are doing, we're ill-equipped to pursue this plan to support salmon resilience. And so that brings us back to the State of Salmon Report and the goals of this work. So I just want to close by pointing you to the report itself. The findings are all available through the website, stateofsalmon.ca. I'm going to do a bit of a walkthrough in a moment to show you the key features of this site. But we also have a static PDF report that aggregates all of the information into a static report that will be available into the future as the website is updated each year. And this year, we also included a highlights report, which is a briefer 8-page summary of the key findings that Katrina presented. And so with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to the team that has helped create this report. within PSF. In particular, Eileen Jones, who has managed this project over the last number of years, and Kathleen Belton, and also the folks we've worked with outside of PSF. So again, we want to have lots of time for discussion and questions, but I'm hoping to turn briefly to a quick walkthrough of the site itself to show you some of the interactive features and how you can explore the state of salmon data. So if you go to stateofsalmon.ca, you'll land on the home page here. I think you can see, it looks like you can see the browser here. The first thing to notice is that there's a big yellow button to download the report, and this will take you to the PDF version of the report that I mentioned. On the main page here, there's a number of key features. The first one is what we affectionately call our fishy dot plot that highlights the results for spawner abundance and total abundance of each regional salmon population. I'm going to return to this to show you some of the interactivity after we just scroll down to look at what else is on this main page. There's a summary of the key findings that Katrina went through, as well as a brief overview of each species across all regions, and then some information on these factors I mentioned affecting salmon. And you can click on these bubbles to get a brief overview. This is an aspect of the report that we are planning to expand on next year, so keep an eye on that. And then finally, a brief description of the path forward and some links to explore within each region. And I'll get into this in a moment. If we return to the fishy dot plot at the top, so here we have the spawner abundance as a percent anomaly from the long-term average. This is the current state metric that Katrina presented. If we click on any of the species here at the top, it highlights each region for that species and what the current state is. And you also get a narrative summary on the right of how this species is doing across regions. Similarly, you can select a region to see the current state for all species within that region. And then at the top here, there's a toggle to move from spawner abundance to total abundance. Katrina mentioned those two types of information that can provide us a different view of how salmon are doing. And so you can toggle between these. And you'll notice that there's fewer fish because we weren't able to assess total abundance for as many populations. And they tend to also be more fish below the long-term average. If we go back to any of the regions, the second part of the site is the regional kind of deep dives. And so you can explore a region by clicking on the map here or selecting it from the menu above or the menu at the bottom of the page. I'm going to choose the Fraser here just as a demo. And within the regional summaries, you have, again, a narrative summary of across all species in that region, what's been happening in recent years, what are the highlights. And then there's a data-driven table that summarizes the current state taken from the fishy dot plot on the overview, but also provides complementary information on the short-term and long-term trends. Similar to the fishy dot plot, you can click on any of the species and you get a little narrative summary of what's behind these numbers and these patterns. Sometimes you can have unexpected results, such as, a species that's above its long-term average, but maybe declining in the short term. And so these narrative summaries on the right dig into that a little bit and try and provide some insight into what's happening. The second interactive charts here in the regional pages, the first one is a summary of the fishy dot plot just for that region. But there's also a tab here for trends. And this provides the time series of each species within that region normalized to be that percent anomaly. And it's interactive, so you can click on and off particular species. You can also select to show the long-term and short-term trends here. And finally, there's a toggle button, like the fishy dot plot, to go from spawner abundance to total abundance and see how the patterns change between those two different types of data. There's some information and links here. And in particular, I wanted to point to links to the Pacific Salmon Explorer, which I mentioned. This is a sister site that provides more detailed information on individual populations within each region. And so I do encourage you to dig deeper into what's happening for any particular species in a region, because you can see, for example, with Fraser sockeye, there's a number of individual conservation units that are in the red, despite the fact that the aggregate population has been doing relatively well in recent years. And then the last part of the region pages is what we call the region profile. And so here you'll find information on the number of conservation units and the actual numbers that went into our State of Salmon report. I will mention, I don't want to get too much into the details of data at this point, but there is a brief sentence here that describes what these numbers represent, because it's not the same for every regional salmon population. Sometimes we do have information that's an absolute count, but in other cases, it's an index of abundance. And so it needs to be interpreted appropriately. So again, you can click among species to see that information for each of the species. And then finally, there's just a description of the region. So what is the geography? What is the history of the region in terms of salmon habitats and development? Just a bit of background there. So those are the main components of the site. There's more information and lots to dig into, so I really encourage you to check it out. But I'm going to turn it back to Jason now, who's going to lead us in a bit of a discussion and Q&A.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Katrina and Stephanie, for that. I hope people that are joining this webcast are finding this overview helpful. Our intent here was to spark discussion and questions and further interest in the State of Salmon report highlights and insights. So one of our aims is that all of you and your colleagues working with salmon feel empowered to use the report's data and insights in your own work. And so we'll turn now, we've got quite a bit of time set aside for discussion, because we didn't want this just to be the PSF team talking out and saying goodbye. Steph and Katrina are ready to take your questions. And it looks like we've got a pretty good group of people who are familiar with Slido. If you put your question in, you can also vote using the thumbs up vote for the ones that you're most interested in that somebody else has asked. And if you do that, it helps us, because it kind of pushes some of those questions up to the top, and we can try to select the questions that have the broadest interest. And we've got a team from PSF in the side room here who are working on organizing and streaming the questions in. So I'd like to make one comment just before we get into the questions, and it's to highlight the point that before Katrina, Stephanie, and the others on the PSF team undertook this, there has never been one place, kind of one report, one platform where you could go and start to explore the question of how are salmon doing. There's never been a method to do it. There's never been a system to do it. And it's always been a struggle. I've spent my whole career working to understand salmon and identify priorities, figure out what's working, what's not, and what should be done. And it's been very difficult to have the big picture of what's going on with salmon. And this is the first time that there's ever been a way to see that. And I think, as Stephanie and Katrina have shown the viewers today, it's not a one-stop shop that answers every question and solves every problem, but it's a really key piece of the puzzle that we've never had before as a salmon constituency. And I hope people look at that and can see that value and interact with us, because we're interested in your feedback, the ways that this can be used, and maybe ways we can help build on this, the Pacific Salmon Explorer, and other tools and supports that we have and can develop and curate at the Pacific Salmon Foundation for all of us who are working on salmon. So that's just a little plug that to sort of try to orient people to this report and for the discussion today. And I think we'll turn to the first question in the Slido from Nicole Fredrickson. Hi, Nicole. Thank you for the question. And Nicole's a good friend with the PSF team. And it's asking, does the State of Salmon report identify differences in abundance and trends between hatchery populations versus wild or natural populations, and specifically for those populations that have seen increasing trends? So, Steph and Katrina, I'll turn that to you to provide some response there.
I can take a first stab at this, Katrina, if you want. Thanks for the question, Nicole. It's a good one, and you're not the first person to ask, so thanks for raising this. For most regions and species, we're not able to actually distinguish hatchery and wild salmon in the aggregate statistics because that information is simply not available. Having said that, our primary interest is assessing the state of wild salmon. And so in some regions, we are able to focus our data sets on wild salmon. And one example of that is West Vancouver Island, where our assessment of spawner abundance is derived from a 14-stream index provided by the Pacific Salmon Commission. And those 14 streams were selected because they have kind of minimal influence of hatcheries on salmon abundance. And so that's kind of one way that we can do that. In other regions, it's very difficult to cleanly separate out hatchery and wild salmon at the scale we're working at. And so it is a combined abundance. And so it varies a little bit, but it's an important question. And it's something that we're hoping to dig in and evolve as we continue to work on improving this report in future years. And I should say all of the information on kind of the specific data sources and what populations go into the statistics is available through the technical documentation that goes along with this report. So if you are interested in digging into those details, you can find them and you can always reach out if you can't.
Thanks, Steph. Katrina, would you like to add anything to that question around hatcheries and assessments?
Yeah, maybe briefly, I'll just say, as I outlined in the presentation, we're really left dealing with the best available information that we have access to. And so in an ideal world, we would have information that separates out enhancement or hatchery fish from wild salmon populations. But as Steph outlined, that seems to be the exception rather than the norm. Mm-hmm. But, our commitment is to improving, and if those data become more available, then we certainly would be using that in future assessments.
All right, well, I'll turn to the next question in the Slido. It's sort of, I think it's segues nicely from that narrative on how information informs our analysis. And it's not so much specific to state of salmon in my interpretation, but it's certainly relevant to the state of salmon question. What do you attribute the reduced monitoring in the central and northern regions to? How can we address this lack of data collection? Given the challenges salmon are facing and the increased pressures from climate change, it seems more critical than ever to have accurate data. I know that Steph and Katrina, working with you, you don't need convincing of that, but what kind of commentary would you have for that question?
Sure, I can take a first crack at offering some commentary. As we showed, and certainly there is some evidence to suggest that we are seeing fewer resources directed towards monitoring. It's hard to pinpoint, why that might be the case. Certainly budgets are tighter. That's an obvious one. But one of the things that we have called out in the paper that I mentioned with a number of PSF co-authors and external collaborators was that we see a bit of a relationship between fisheries catches and the number of spawning populations that are monitored. And so traditionally speaking, a lot of the assessment effort has been directed towards monitoring spawner surveys and salmon spawning abundances to inform fisheries management measures. And over time, as we've seen some of these fisheries decline due to lower abundances, we've also seen a concurrent decline in the monitoring as the need to monitor drops off. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to push forward is that need to monitor doesn't disappear, even if there aren't, large commercial fisheries, for example. It's important for us to be monitoring for conservation's sake. We can't manage what we don't measure. And part of the key part in monitoring is to be able to do what we're doing here today, which is to assess the conservation risks. So we're making a case to increase and continue monitoring in these areas, even if they don't support the more traditional commercial fisheries. These salmon populations certainly support cultures and local communities, indigenous fisheries, and others. So it is important to continue monitoring. In terms of, what are some of the solutions? What can we do? I think directing more resources and intention to data stewardship. So a lot of the times, and this really speaks to our efforts with the State of Salmon Report, there is great information that's being collected largely by local communities. Often it's hard to put a finger or to find where these data are if you don't know who to talk to or what's being collected. So investing more as a community as a whole in terms of stewarding the data that is being collected, centralizing it, making it available publicly. And this is something that has been a large focus of our efforts here at PSF in terms of synthesizing the information that already exists and democratizing that information to be able to help ourselves and other folks outside of PSF get a sense of, are there conservation concerns? Where are there opportunities for sustainable fisheries? And so that's really important. And I think the last comment I would offer, and then Steph, I'm sure you have some comments as well, is that investing monitoring across BC and the Yukon, investing those resources in local communities, whether it's stewardship groups, Indigenous communities, that is an important part of understanding local trends in salmon populations. And I think we can rethink the way we make investments as a broader salmon conservation community to make sure that those communities are invested in and have the resources they need to monitor and collect the data. And importantly, as I said, to ensure that the data are shared to inform assessments such as this.
Thanks, Katrina. Steph, do you want to offer any additional commentary on that?
I think that was pretty thorough. Again, just emphasizing there's kind of two parts of this. There's the collection of the information on the ground, and then there's the sharing and ensuring that, that data stewardship step happens. And there is a bit of a tension and some challenges with that latter step. In particular, as we're seeing First Nations take increasing leadership over collecting these data, we need to make sure that the sharing respects Indigenous data sovereignty and care principles. So we recognize that this is, it's a nuanced issue and it's challenging, but we're keen to work together and focus on kind of the mutual benefits to all parties of making data available.
Thanks, Steph. I think that's a nice way to wrap that one up. And I think it's something that, in my observation, is not really focused on any one particular place. I think it's a challenge within the entire space that Pacific salmon are in, within our jurisdictions and territories. And maybe some places are doing better than others, but I think there's a big gap to fill in terms of having that purposeful, deliberate, a relatively comprehensive monitoring framework so that we can inform how things are going and what kinds of things we need to prioritize and invest in. We'll go to the next question that's been pinned to the top of the Slido here from another one of our friends, from Betty. Hi, Betty. It says, many of the stocks in the Skeena and Nass North Coast have not been assessed by COSUIC, despite having low abundance. Has there been any interest or effort by COSUIC and others to use the PSE data to identify candidate species for assessment? Steph, Katrina, why don't you can jump in and take that?
Yeah, I can take a first crack, and I know, Steph, you can add some commentary here for sure. Great question. Appreciate it. There certainly has been some effort to use some of the data largely coming from our sister tool that Steph has mentioned, the Pacific Salmon Explorer, to inform COSUIC's efforts to look at all salmon conservation units across BC and the Yukon to help prioritize which conservation units or groups of conservation units should be assessed through COSUIC. So there is collaboration happening on the back end. It is informing those priorities. And Steph can elaborate on that. She's been more directly involved. In terms of have there been any efforts for the North Coast, as far as I'm aware, there haven't been. I have heard discussions around intention to look at all salmon species, for example, in the North Coast, the Skeena and the Nass for COSUIC assessment. But I don't have the current update in terms of where that's at. The last comment I would just offer is that we do look at a lot of similar metrics that are used in COSUIC assessments on both the Pacific Salmon Explorer and the State of Salmon website. And so those can offer similar, though not the same, insights in terms of conservation risks. And I think the COSUIC assessments are wonderful. They're a very important tool. But usually by the time we get to that point, the conservation units are facing an extinction risk. And so I think part of the messaging and the emphasis for PSF on resilience and recovery is trying to call out where those conservation risks are and to inform and inspire action to mitigate those risks without necessarily having to go through kind of a multi-year process to do a thorough assessment, which is important, but that shouldn't preclude any efforts in the short term to help us think about what can we do to help support the conservation and management of salmon that might be at risk.
Thanks, Katrina. Steph, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that was a great summary. I think, this is an area that we're keen to continue to work on because as much as we love doing these assessments, we really want to see them used. And so application to processes like COSEWIC assessments is an area that we're involved in and would like to kind of seek continue.
Well, Steph, maybe I'll keep you on point here for the next question on our Slido list. Are the threat assessments able to provide an understanding of which particular threats may be driving the trend within the conservation unit?
Yeah, that's a real challenge. So we do provide in the Salmon Explorer habitat threat assessments. I kind of mentioned, the urban and industrial development. We provide those assessments. We don't necessarily do any analysis to try and understand what are the leading threats or, the probability of certain threats driving declines that we might be seeing. That's one of the great challenges, I think, of salmon science is doing that work. But I think it provides information on, potential drivers and potential areas for recovery planning. So, it's very hard to definitively link patterns in salmon abundance to particular factors. Having said that, that's something that we're looking at, including in the State of Salmon moving forward, is more of a narrative summary of what main drivers within each region might be based on the relative pressures and what we understand. So that might be a bit of an unsatisfactory answer. But I think the information is important. It's difficult to say with any certainty what factors are driving the trends we're seeing, but we can certainly, provide fodder for discussion and future work.
But I even think the idea that you can't go to a tool, any of the tools like that we have in place that they're very powerful, but still they're not a magic, input output button where tell me what to do. It is wickedly complex, and I think in cases where we have some good indication, people are showing some good results in their local systems, but it points to the complexity of this world of salmon and the challenges we have in terms of the available data, the available background science, the available monitoring and assessment, as we've been kind of touching on through the threads of questions here. Katrina, did you want to add anything further to that around how can we inform threats assessments? Or
yeah,
use them?
maybe just to add a little bit to that, I think, as you said, it's kind of one of those wicked challenges to pinpoint, which of the things might be driving the patterns we're seeing. And I think reframing the question in terms of the things we're saying that we know can affect salmon abundance negatively or positively, which of those things can we actually do something about? And there's some things that are a lot more difficult to resolve, global climate change. There's certainly things we can do at an individual level, but that is a more intractable challenge. So what are the levers we have, whether they're management levers or conservation levers, and thinking about focusing our efforts on those and prioritizing those strategies as opposed to just focusing on perhaps the most threat. Which threats can we do something about and they're within our control to affect?
All right, thanks. We'll jump to the next question. It's one that I know is right up the alley for both of you. How do changes in data quality over time impact the summary statistic of percent increase or decrease? Do we also produce an uncertainty estimate to gauge the level of confidence we should have on the numbers? So I'm not sure which of you would like to take the first kick at that one, but I'll turn it to you guys.
Sure, I can take a first stab because I love talking about uncertainty and outputs. So I appreciate the question. So one thing to recognize is that the data sets we rely on are different from region to region, depending on what's available. So in some cases, we try and have a time series that is representative and comparable among years. But that means that, in some regions, we may have a time series of over 100 years, like for Fraser sockeye, and in other regions, we might only have 20 years of data. But within that time series, it is very important that the numbers represent something that we can compare across time. We don't provide an estimate of uncertainty associated with the current state. That is something that you could do if you had an estimate of uncertainty in the underlying data, but that's not something that's usually available to us. Having said that, this is an important question. It's an area that we've talked about adding to in this report moving forward, trying to better capture uncertainty. And that might not be kind of a confidence interval in the number, but it could be something like how many spawner surveys go into the number that we're seeing. And this gets at Katrina's point of decline in monitoring. We have a lot more certainty when, we have numerous surveys throughout a region that we're drawing on compared to maybe one fish wheel that is informing the whole regional salmon assessment. And as an example of that, when we go to the northern transboundary region that borders on Alaska and the Yukon, there's very little salmon assessment that's happening up there. And so for some of our reporting, we are relying on a single fish wheel in the Taku River to tell us about how pink salmon are doing across the region. And so I would say that has lower certainty than maybe in the Fraser, where we've got numerous spawner surveys that we're drawing on to help inform the results. So it's an excellent point and something that we're considering kind of adding in more formally moving forward. It disappeared from the slide. I was trying to think. There was a second part to that question.
I don't, maybe our team, if you can pop that question back up, we can come back to it. But Katrina, did you want to add anything to that while we look for the second part to that question?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree. The uncertainty is really important to communicate. And as Steph says, we want to do a better job of quantifying that uncertainty, making it explicit and present in how we present this work in the future. Two comments I would share is that one, in highlighting some of the data gaps, that's, a qualitative effort on our part to really kind of showcase that the data aren't equal across regions, as Steph just highlighted with the northern transboundary watersheds as an example. And that's a really important step for, gauging how much weight and emphasis to put on the results, but also to guide and direct where we need to be doing more monitoring on the ground to improve the precision of the estimates we put out there. I think that's one point. The second point I would make is that, part of this effort, it's been a big job to compile and synthesize the information. And we know that it's not perfect. And we're by no means saying this is the state of salmon. There's no alternative narrative. But we are trying to create a bit of a narrative and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, in that we're using the best available information that we have access to tell a bit of a story, to put those parameters on how salmon are doing. It's not perfect, but not going so far as to disregard it completely given the uncertainty.
Thanks, Katrina. And Steph, our team's got the question back up. So the second part was, do we produce an uncertainty estimate?
Yeah.
And I think you touched on that, but I'll just come back to you to see if you wanted to wrap that one up.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for coming back. I see it now. I think one thing that I just wanted to touch on briefly was the trend statistics as well. We do incorporate uncertainty in those, in that we have 3 potential trend outcomes: increasing, decreasing, or stable. And the stable trend outcome we assign when, the trend is uncertain enough that we can't be sure it's different from zero or no trend. So there's a bit of uncertainty that comes into that categorization of trends.
All right, thanks. We'll go to the next one now. And I think this one, the way I'm interpreting it, it's more of a science and policy and management question than it is specific to State of Salmon. But we'll go to the question first, and then I'll make a suggestion on a couple of ways we could touch on it. What does PSF think of the concept of overspawning or overescapement? That term came up a lot this summer with the larger sockeye return and the need to harvest more aggressively to avoid overspawn. Is there anything to this, or is it just a convenient excuse to go fishing? So I don't think we were sort of planning today to get deep into management philosophy or policy or or scientific analysis, but you're both experts in the field. If you wanted to comment on that, I'd turn to you and open the floor for it. And I also think, Katrina, this might be a place to touch on some of that trends over time narrative that you had in your part of the talk, if you wanted to attach it to that. So I'll turn over to Steph and Katrina to take around that question however you see fit.
I could take a first crack. I will be brief. Certainly those concepts of overspawning or overescapement, there is basis to that in that natural systems have capacity to those systems to support populations. And it is something we need to be looking at. And at times when you see capacity of the habitats, for example, being exceeded, you do see increased competition for habitat and prey resources, which can affect the growth of fish, which can in turn affect their survival as they go about their life cycle. So it is something to be thinking about. It's also important to be thinking about when we're talking about enhancement. There is kind of a natural capacity of these systems. And so we need to be looking at enhancements as conservation measures, not necessarily measures to be driving, beyond what the system can support. So I'll keep it brief and turn it over to you, Steph, if you have thoughts to share.
Sure. I guess maybe just one thing I'll add is that we have to keep in mind the relatively short baseline we have with this report, but also, in terms of our numerical abundance records. And as Katrina said, overspawning and overescapement is a reality, but we don't have to look back that far, or, you can talk to any number of First Nations to understand abundances back 100, 200 years. And I think it's fair to say that we've declined significantly from that point, probably across all regions and species. And so I would hesitate to say that what we saw this summer was at risk of overspawning or reaching those historical abundances. And again, as Katrina started out with this talk, the whole point of this report was to put that perspective, that longer term perspective, but it's still just a short snapshot in time relative to the longer history of salmon on our coast.
Yeah, and my own sort of, I'll call it non-technical analytical way of interpreting that. This year's Fraser sockeye return was very good relative to the preseason forecast. But looking at the modern history was good. Like, it wasn't extraordinary. It wasn't like, wow, we've never seen this many fish. It was in the range of good, but it was in the range of returns that have been seen semi-frequently over time, just not a lot lately. Would that be kind of a fair way to interpret it in terms of how we can look at state of salmon collation and look at questions like that?
Mm-hmm.
Good. If it would have been embarrassing if I was really wrong on that in front of everybody. There's another question here, and I might try to ask you to comment on that one and another one that's been sitting in our Slido queue for a while. So the one at the top is, what opportunities are there for First Nation guardians to help you guys with this work? Which is like, awesome. We'd love to be included in that kind of conversation. And there's one from Michelle that's in the Slido queue that's been there for a while. And it says, I've noticed in the years we were blessed with millions of wild salmon, the ecological indicators were our first sign of abundance. Are there other Indigenous people on here who have indicators of the species in abundance? So I'm not sure, Michelle, if that question was for the participants that are Indigenous to comment on, or if you wanted our team to comment on it. But I thought maybe our team could comment on the connections or ideas of PSF working with First Nation and Indigenous entities on this kind of work, and maybe try to address both of those questions in the course of our response. So again, over to you, Steph and Katrina, to respond to that as you see fit.
I can jump in and then turn it to you, Steph. The short answer is yes, absolutely. Recognizing that Indigenous communities have already been monitoring and stewarding these populations for millennia. So perhaps we flip it on its head and we think about how we can support them in continuing the stewardship work that they're doing. And certainly PSF has been trying to do that with our partners. Some examples of that are on the Central Coast, working with the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance and the nations that they work with to think about what are the priority salmon populations for monitoring, what are the types of monitoring approaches that we need to put in place and that we can help direct resources to. And so there's actually an Indigenous-led salmon monitoring framework that we developed with the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance several years ago that provides a bit of a blueprint for how we could go about doing that and strategizing and prioritizing our investments to support that work, that monitoring work on the ground. So I would say that's a great jumping off point and a place where that kind of thinking and approach can be replicated. So I'd say that's one. Another area that we've been focused on in recent years is working with a number of Indigenous partners to look at bridging Western science approaches with Indigenous-led monitoring approaches, and in particular, using artificial intelligence to augment and support monitoring efforts. So working in collaboration with several nations. One example is working with the Heiltsuk Nation on the Central Coast, looking on the Quay River. And there's a traditional fence for counting salmon where there's an underwater camera deployed. And over the past 5 years, we've been working with a number of partners, including SFU and the Wild Salmon Center and the Heiltsuk Nation and others, to be able to use AI to quantify returns and to help count those fish as they're coming through to identify their species, their sex, whether they're hatchery or non-hatchery fish. And this is really augmenting those efforts, making it less cumbersome and time-consuming so that Indigenous guardians, for example, can have their time freed up to walk streams and do other work related to salmon monitoring. So there's no shortage of opportunities. I think the biggest challenge right now is directing resources towards those communities so that they have the resources they need to continue doing the monitoring.
Thanks, Katrina. Steph, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, maybe just to say, I find Michelle's question about ecological indicators quite intriguing. And I do want to emphasize this report is very much based in Western science, and we see it as one eye of a two-eyed seeing approach to understanding salmon. And when it comes to local management, bringing in that local knowledge, that Indigenous knowledge, and the ecological indicators will be really important. It is challenging to do at a broad scale like the BC and Yukon that we're working at with this report. So it's a really important question, and we'd love to see that done at local scales where it makes sense. And if there's, I find it a really great question. So thanks, Michelle, for bringing it up, and I'd love to think more about that.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of the PSF team, just to add to that, I appreciate the first part of these two questions was how can First Nation guardians help us with this kind of work? But I would put the same question back out to First Nation guardians and people working for First Nation entities is how can we help you? Like, what do you need in order to have the information to understand the resource in your territory? How can we help you use tools like the ones we've developed or turn them into applied use to help with your stewardship, your resilience, your recovery goals and priorities for your territory? So appreciate the question. And I think, as Katrina and Steph have said, we will welcome working with people from First Nations communities and organizations, but we want to be reciprocal. And I think we want to really look at the products and the platforms that we've developed and help people put them to applied use to solve real world problems right down to the level of working in communities and territories. So I'll just kind of maybe leave that as an endpoint on that idea. Like, we see this as an ongoing interaction. This isn't PSF putting something on the shelf and, kind of saying we nailed that and walking away. We think this is an ongoing piece of work, and there is a lot to do. And as Steph said right at the outset, that the way forward is for all of us to work on this together, bringing the best that we can bring from wherever we come from. I'm not sure. I think, didn't we cover that one at the top of the Slido queue already? The threats that can be driving trends? Yeah, okay. So maybe that's just a maintenance thing for me. This next one is one that I know has been an issue amongst the, I'll say, the more applied and analytical users of salmon data and information. So it's one that we might want to spend a bit of time to unpack. But the question is, can you please discuss the benefits and drawbacks of aggregating the status of species at various scales? Are you concerned that people might overlook some key stocks that are critically low when they examine the aggregate findings that might show things in general are doing better? And Steph and Katrina, I know you guys touched on this a little bit in your talk, but in light of the question and knowing that there's a bit to unpack here, maybe we'll sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive into what's behind this. And Steph, I think we've started with Katrina a couple of times. Do you mind if we start with you on this one?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we were concerned about when we first developed this report. So Katrina has led, work on the Pacific Salmon Explorer for over a decade now. We've been invested in looking at status at the scale of conservation units, those genetically and ecologically unique groups of fish that are really kind of the foundation of salmon diversity. And so shifting towards a more aggregated scale of assessment was a concern for us off the beginning. I will say that. At the same time, you mentioned benefits and drawbacks. The benefit is that we can have a much simpler and clearer picture of what's happening across the whole Pacific Canada, which is hard to do at the scale of conservation units. There's a lot of data gaps and it's easy to be overwhelmed. So again, I think one of the benefits is the clarity that this report provides at a broad scale, but the drawback is certainly that the aggregate statistics for a regional salmon population might not represent the individual conservation units or unique groups within that region. And we do need to be focused on conserving all of those unique groups within a region, because that's what's going to provide the resilience and the ingredients for adaptation. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to emphasize the sister tool of the Salmon Explorer. We're thinking of ways to more tightly couple these two tools so that people can, first see the information in a relatively simple way on the State of Salmon tool and, easily see how they can dig deeper to understand that diversity within each region and species. And so that's an area that we're hoping to expand on next year. And we're also working from the other end on the Pacific Salmon Explorer to link those conservation unit results to the regional overviews. So that's work that you'll see kind of rolling out over the next year with the Salmon Explorer. And it's a great point. And we've even talked about, maybe trying to bring in some sort of diversity metric along with the current state. And so those are things that we're actively exploring, because it is an important point, and it's one that we've heard loud and clear.
Thanks, Steph. Katrina, do you want to add to that?
Maybe just briefly, as Steph has said, we had started with a finer scale tool, the Pacific Salmon Explorer. And one of the drawbacks of that is that the response to how different salmon conservation units are doing, can't be summarized in a very simple way. The answer is often it depends on which conservation unit you're looking at, which is not a very satisfactory answer for people that just want kind of a quick soundbite on how are salmon doing. And so one of the benefits of going to this broad scale aggregate approach is that we can get that message out in terms of kind of seeing the forest for the trees. And I think that's really important. But as Steph has highlighted, it doesn't stop there. We need to go back to that finer scale to figure out what can we do collectively as a salmon conservation community to mitigate those concerns. And you have to go back to the conservation unit to think about what are those strategies to put in place. And so one of the kind of drawbacks of the broad scale aggregate approach is that you might miss really important levers that are going to make the most difference, the positive impact for salmon, if you're only focusing, for example, Chinook salmon in the Fraser. That's just too broad a scale to really think about what are those kind of micro levers that we can pull to support salmon conservation recovery.
Well, thanks for that, you guys. I think I'll add a bit of commentary to that. It's important for people that are joining us today that would be using the report and the online tools to really appreciate the point that we understand that rolling up at an aggregate scale is not really the management story and the management target. But there's utility in rolling it up, as Steph and Katrina have mentioned, in order to be able to summarize at a high level what's going on in the big picture. Like if you've only got 4 or 5 minutes speaking to a decision maker, a policy influencer, an elected official, or, in PSF's case, maybe a donor who's wondering what's going on. We don't necessarily have the opportunity, and they don't necessarily always have the interest to sit down and have us walk them through 400 and some odd conservation units and tell them all these stories. You can lose people's attention. But when we can say something like 2/3 of salmon populations are doing more poorly than long-term trends, there are some big picture highlights like pink are doing better, fish in the north are doing more poorly. There are some positive signs like this, but there are qualifications, say what Katrina just spoke to in terms of Chinook. It gets you started on that conversation, and it gives you the bridge to that deeper dive to the conservation unit, watershed, territory scale details that really are the things that we should be managing to. And so it's meant to be a complementary tool, not a replacement for the need to understand what's going on at the conservation unit or watershed or local scale, but a complement to that, so that all of us in the salmon constituency can relate to people what's going on who don't do this every day. If you're speaking with a journalist, if you're speaking with an elected official, if you're speaking with a member at large in your community, you can start here and then work it down to that fine local scale of detail. So that's kind of the idea behind why we have this report. And I'll say, I think we've said this in some of our presentations, the impetus from this comes from one of our former board members, Ross Beatty, who says, look, I'm a board member for PSF. People ask me all the time, what's going on with salmon? And I can't bring you guys into the room with me to have you tell the story of 400 different conservation units. I need you to roll this up at a higher level so that I can give people a bit of a picture in the circles I relate to. And then if they're interested, they can come in for more detail to you experts and help to unpack those details. So that's kind of the high level perspective of what we're trying to achieve here. And we hope the tool is providing that kind of benefit to people to add another tool to the conversation. And if I got anything wrong there, Steph or Katrina, you can to flag that down and correct it. We'll go to the next question on the list. We've still got some incoming here, so we'll cover as much as we can. The report and the presentation mention a decline in monitoring as a key issue. So what opportunities do we see for filling in some of those major data gaps in data scarce areas? And how can partners and collaborators and supporters help solve some of these challenges? So Katrina and Steph, you guys did touch on this a little bit as you went through your narrative, but I think we can all appreciate this question and putting a fine point on it. So maybe, Katrina, I'll start with you on this one and then come to Steph just to give some perspective on where we see those opportunities.
Yeah, I would probably offer 3 things. One I've touched on already, so I can be brief, and that really is leveraging new technology. So I mentioned the use of artificial intelligence. I think that presents a huge opportunity to scale up and deploy that technology more broadly. You've mentioned that we have some pilot locations, but this technology is now at the point where it can scale appropriately to limit the amount of time that humans have to be reviewing, for example, 10,000 hours of video footage to count salmon, and redeploy that effort and that human capacity to other and better uses of their time. So I think that's a huge opportunity. The other thing I would highlight is that we've emphasized a lot about spawner information and spawner surveys, and there's no question that that's a decline and we need to increase and bolster our efforts. But there's also other types of information that we need to be collecting to paint that fuller picture of how salmon are doing. And, for example, better information on fisheries harvest. So, knowing where, when, and how many fish are being harvested from what populations in all fisheries is really important for us to understand that total abundance statistic, how many fish are coming back but might be intercepted by fisheries, so that we really understand what's that total productive capacity of a population that we might be missing if we're just relying on spawner abundance information. So I would say that's the second important piece. And the third one is around prioritizing and, recognizing that we ultimately, at the end of the day, have limited resources. We don't, certainly as a collective community, have resources to support monitoring everywhere all the time. And so thinking about investing in a strategic plan for monitoring to address the data gaps that are really undermining our ability to assess the state of salmon. And as I've said before in the presentation, we've tended to focus on populations in the southern parts of the province, where those populations tend to support larger fisheries, but we need to be thinking broadly. And as Steph highlighted in some of the points that she spoke to, we need to be thinking about the species as a whole, because ultimately that scope and that diversity is what builds resilience. So designing a monitoring plan that really looks at all of BC and the Yukon and identifies those priorities that are really going to push the dial in terms of our improved ability to assess the state of salmon, and then resourcing that plan.
That's it, eh? That's all we have to do, and then we'll have it solved. Steph, what would you like to say on this one?
I think Katrina covered it. Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll just stay on this thread for a minute. There's a question from Shirley that I think follows this line of questioning. I'm part of a group of stream keepers here on the Sunshine Coast. Perhaps we could start to target the areas of no monitoring and develop stream keeper teams. So, Steph or Katrina, would you like to just comment on that, further to the discussion we've just been having on the absence or challenges of monitoring gaps?
You want to go?
I'm going to wait. I mean, it's a great suggestion, and I think the reality is that already these spawner surveys do rely on local salmon stewards and champions to be continued. And in many cases, we've seen, the same groups or even same people run these spawner surveys for decades. And so it's really important to have that local involvement. I think we do need to think about creative ways to get people involved, because the reality is that, this is becoming more of a distributed effort, whereas historically maybe DFO led the majority of monitoring, especially with increasing leadership from First Nations on monitoring. I think there's space to take a more of a distributed approach to this. However, that does require still leadership on the data stewardship piece. And so as great as it is to have input from various groups and people, we need to ensure that the resulting data are compiled, quality checked, the associated information about the surveys is there. So in short, yes, but we need to think carefully about how we move forward to ensure that it's effort not wasted.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I can speak to that kind of firsthand, thinking there are data that I collected in my early days as a biologist that probably only live in one of my old field notebooks or on a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk, and people who don't know what that is can look it up. And yeah, and it's functionally useless, right? Even though I collected it earnestly and thought I was doing really good work, the fact that it was collected but was not curated properly and put somewhere where it could contribute to the body of knowledge that can inform what we do, it made the effort kind of fizzle. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who's done something like this. Even organizationally, I've seen efforts where, we're going to compile something and then software changes and there's, no resources or expertise to maintain a platform, and the data starts to get stale, and then we lose access to it, and then it becomes unavailable or irrelevant. So the idea of data stewardship for, say, people like me that are maybe more field oriented is, yeah, I'm going to go get the data, but that's not the only piece of the puzzle. We have to make sure that the data is as Steph says, being compiled appropriately. It has appropriate quality, ideally has some continuity, so it's not just one and done. If we can do those things, then it's really starting to contribute powerfully to informing what's going on, and then how we can use that knowledge to make good decisions. I'll just see, Katrina or Steph, if you wanted to comment on that a little bit, because you guys are really the experts. I'm more commenting as the guy that causes the problem, but if you have any views on that.
We won't fault you, Jason, for using a floppy disk. No wonder we couldn't find the data. Yeah, I mean, I would just briefly say that kind of comes back to a point I was making previously, which is it needs to start with a plan. And, often when we see a crisis or we see a need, it's really easy to have a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to get on the ground and collect all the information and think about what we're going to do with it after. And we have a lot of data, but as Steph said, we need to be thinking about what data, to what standard, how is collected, and ultimately what's the intended end use. And so again, that comes back to a plan, knowing where we need the data, to what quality, and making sure it's being collected to serve the need that we're seeking. And in this case, to be able to see if there's a conservation risk. So I would just advocate further for having that plan. It breeds that awareness of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that only benefits our efforts just as the state of salmon.
Thanks, Katrina. I'll come to the next question around rec fishery data, but just before I pose it, our team in the side room, there was a question that I think might have dropped off the list from someone about the size of the fish and its how that's considered in this. And I think that might be one that we could include before we wrap here. So if you could find that one and put it back up, I'd appreciate it. But we'll go to this one on the rec fishery that's pinned to the top here. How is recreational fishery data used to find the state of salmon populations? Is there data to show how catch and release affects fish health and survival? Katrina, I know you are thoughtful about the rec fishery stuff. Do you want to start? Or go ahead, Steph, if you're ready.
I could just briefly say that the rec fishery data is generally included in the total abundance statistics that we report. So it's one of the fisheries or catch data that's included in that statistic. So when it is reported, we do include it, and it's wrapped into that total abundance assessment.
Katrina, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would just add, in the way that Steph has described, it's accounted for in the information we put out. It definitely isn't parsing out that source of mortality as something different. And we don't do that for any kind of fishery within the State of Salmon Report. But I think this goes back to the comments around data collection and data availability. And, there's no question that we need to be collecting better data on all fisheries harvests. And really, this comes from a place that, we want to try and find ways to support sustainable fisheries. And the way to do that is trying to look at strategies for minimizing impacts to at-risk stocks that allow sustainable fisheries on more abundant stocks. And, that starts and ends with improving data collection for recreational fisheries, for commercial fisheries, for all fisheries. And I think that's what we would point towards to better inform kind of how we look at total returns to salmon systems.
I'll just add a comment here, and I'll check with you guys to see if this resonates with you. I think the point here is not that we're pointing fingers at fisheries saying you're not doing enough. It's more that there is a need to get as much data as we can, and the current management system is probably not doing that. It's not necessarily the fault of the entities who are fishing, whether it be recreational or commercial or First Nations or otherwise. That's not necessarily what we're saying. We're saying that fishing is happening. It's one of the things that has an effect on sustainability and outcomes for salmon. And we don't necessarily have all the data that we could or would like to have to inform and understand those fisheries so that we can manage them optimally. And there's more that can be done. And, I know the PSF team are partnering with Indigenous entities, with recreational fishing entities to try to further inform that. So there is a lot of work underway, but there's a lot of work to be done to get the information that we could be getting to inform these kinds of things further. Would that be kind of a fair way to characterize that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
The more information, the better. And, particularly since we're taking a data-driven approach, the more investments and the more informed we be, the more tailored our strategies can be for conservation and management.
Okay, thanks. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I don't think we need a lot of time for wrap up. So we'll take this next top question on the list, the one I asked to bring back. It's asking, is there any interest in assessing the average size of salmon that has largely been in decline? Ecological, food, and commercial value is largely based on biomass rather than individuals. And I think I might just extend that question to, the question around, you can have the same number of fish, but if they're smaller, they generally will have fewer eggs, which, can kind of mask a potential change in the productivity of a population. So maybe just adding that dimension to this question around assessing size of salmon in terms of thinking about state of salmon. And I'll invite you guys to comment on that.
Yeah, I saw this question and kind of jumped on it because I'm actually joining from Whitehorse, Yukon, and we've definitely seen this with Yukon Chinook. And so the Yukon Chinook are a population where they've actually monitored, the size of returning females, the number of eggs they produce, and the proportion of female fish in the population. And we've seen declines in all of those, and the resulting impact on productivity or the number of sort of recruits that each individual spawner contributes to the next generation is significant. The State of Salmon Report is based on abundance data alone because the reality is that in most places we don't have more detailed information on size or fecundity that would allow us to dig into those other metrics. But I think it's a really important point to keep in mind when we interpret the numbers, because we have seen these shifts in other regions as well. And it does mean that we need more salmon to reach the same returns the next year than we used to in the past. And so it's a component of sort of the shifting baseline and the potential to kind of overestimate or be overly optimistic about the status. So thanks for raising the point. And I think it's something to keep in mind, and unfortunately not something that we can capture in our statistics right now, but we will try and highlight it in the narrative.
Thanks, Steph. Katrina, do you want to comment on that one any further?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question because it is really important. And I think the example from the Yukon is a great one. As Steph said, we can't do this everywhere. So unfortunately, it's not something we can build in to the statistics at this point. But to me, the kind of key takeaway is that, we need a bit of a paradigm shift in the way we're thinking about salmon and, what they provide to economies, to communities, to ecosystems. And, the example of changes in size at age is an important one. What does that mean for ecosystems, for communities? I think that's important. On the flip side, I've talked a lot about monitoring. We shouldn't necessarily just be putting monitoring budgets towards informing management measures for commercial fisheries. We need to be monitoring for resilience and for conservation. And so I think broadly what PSF is trying to put forward in this is thinking about how we need to think differently about conservation and management and paying attention to indicators like changes in size at age that might be changing over the past, decade or so, that should be top of mind when we're thinking about conservation and management.
Thanks, you guys. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so we'll maybe turn to wrap up. I'm going to give you guys a 20-second warning here. I'll come to you to give any last thought you have, maybe on what you hope people will take away from today, or what you hope they will see or consider from the State of Salmon Report. I'll say that the PSF team has put a lot of effort into this behind the scenes. And so we do appreciate people's interest, and we hope people will see fit to use it and find positive and beneficial ways to use this information. And we are also very keen to hear from you if you have advice, suggestions, questions on what you're seeing here today, whether it's from what we've covered today or what you see in your own explorations of the platform and the report. So, Steph, in a few seconds, would you have any last word that you'd like to leave the audience with today?
Thanks, Jason. I think just reiterating your last point, we'd love to hear from people. PSF is committed to producing this report every year, and we hope that we can evolve it and improve on it and make it useful to people. And so hearing about features that you found useful, statistics you'd like to see, information that you felt was lacking, really helps us make sure that this report is hitting home and helping salmon.
Thanks, Steph. Katrina, how about you? Final word.
Yeah, well, I just want to thank everyone for attending. This presentation today really summarizes part of our motivation is that we wanted to engage people who care so deeply about salmon in the issues. And we see that through the line of questioning. So we hope at a minimum that we can continue to do that. And as Jason and Steph said, we want to hear your feedback. If it's not hitting the mark, please let us know. We want to remain adaptive and iterate as we go forward.
All right. Well, Stephanie and Katrina, thank you for spending that time really unpacking the State of Salmon report and platform, sharing it with people, taking these questions. I hope for the audience it's been helpful, and we appreciate you spending some time with the PSF team today. As we've said, we'd be happy to hear from you afterwards. We do have all the questions saved, and we'll have a look at those, and if there are any we can respond to offline, we will. And so with that, I'll thank everyone. Appreciate your time today, and have a good rest of your day.